Welcome. We'll continue discussing the stratified epithelial tissue. We've discussed the simple epithelial already. We said that it is the tissue that is made up of only one cell layer. But in the stratified epithelial tissue, we're going to have multiple layers. And that's why we call it stratified. It is found in areas where friction occurs, thus protecting and preserving the internal organs it covers or lines. So the main function of the stratified epithelial tissue in general, without being specific, is protection. Protects and preserve the internal organs. Stratified epithelial tissue is classified according to the shape of the cells in the superficial layer. So we classify the stratified epithelial tissues according to the cell shape in the superficial layer or the apical layer. For example, when we have the stratified squamous epithelial tissue, we have multiple layers, but the layer in the surface or the apical layer is squamous, meaning flattened cells. Same thing applies to the cuboidal. So we have multiple layers. Maybe those layers have different shapes, but what we care about is that the cell in the apex looks cuboidal. Same thing applies to the columnar. And for the transitional epithelial tissue, here is kind of the freak one here, because the transitional epithelial tissue, they look round or dome-shaped or umbrella-shaped in the relaxed state, but they actually look flattened when they're stretched, but not fully squamous. So the cells transition in shape between cuboidal and squamous depending on the bladder volume, if the example we're talking about is the bladder. You can think about the transitional epithelium like shape-shifting armor. When the bladder is empty, the cells look dome-shaped, but when it fills and stretches, they flatten out to let the organ expand. That's why it's called transitional. Question: answer the following questions. What is the type of tissues? What is the type of tissue in areas subject to friction? It's stratified epithelial tissue. What is the main function of stratified epithelial tissue? As mentioned earlier, protects and preserves the internal organs it covers or lines. And of course, a very important question, that telling you the stratified epithelial tissue is classified according to the shape of the cell in the superficial layer. Now we're starting with the stratified squamous epithelial tissue. Same thing with the simple. We're going to have either a question telling you to mention the characteristics or features of this tissue, and you're going to mention everything, or we can extract questions where the answer is going to be very short. So, in the stratified squamous epithelial tissue, it consists of multiple layers of cells. Of course, because it's stratified, so you're always going to mention that the tissue is made up of multiple layers. Same thing when you have the question, what are the characteristics or features of these cells that make up the stratified squamous epithelium? So there are multiple layers of cells. Okay, so you always write this down if the tissue type is stratified. The basal layer cell is composed of columnar or cuboidal cells that rest on the basement membrane. So the basal layer that is in contact with the basement membrane, they look columnar or cuboidal. Okay, they don't have to be squamous in order to classify it as squamous. We only care about the superficial layer being squamous here. So the middle layer contains polyhedral cells, while the surface layer are made up of flattened squamous cells. These surface cells may also be keratinized, as seen in the outermost layer of the skin, the epidermis. Now, the word polyhedral cells. Polyhedral means that the cell have multiple faces, like a 3D block. Think like a cube-like shape or a brick-like in 3D tissue section. We're also going to mention the word polygonal cell and other tissue types. So do not confuse polygonal with polyhedral. Polygonal is like when the cell have a multiple sides in 2D shape, like a shape on a slide, not 3D. Also, when I say keratinized, keratinized mean that the stratified squamous epithelium is full of keratin, and the surface layer is basically full of keratin, and it is considered a dead cell. Okay, so they are considered dead cells. The upper cells have no nuclei and are packed with keratin, and this is found in the epidermis of the skin. The function of keratinized epithelium is protection against the abrasion, protection against pathogens, and protection against dehydration. And keratin, what is keratin? The keratin is the tough fibrous protein that makes cells waterproof, resistant to friction, and mechanically strong. It is found in the skin and also found in hair and nails. So again, keratinized epithelium, or keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, has a surface of layer of dead cells. Anucleated cells, meaning no nucleus, and filled with keratin. And they form a tough protective barrier like in the skin. But the stratified squamous epithelium is not always keratinized. Okay, we can have two types, either keratinized or non-keratinized. So I'm just describing it to get the full picture, okay? But you don't have to know much details. It forms the inner lining of the mouth and esophagus, and its primary function is protection. Question: what is the type of tissue for each of the following? So inner lining of the mouth, inner lining of the esophagus, and outermost layer of the skin, the epidermis. For the first two, it's basically stratified squamous epithelial tissue. And for this one here being specific, the outermost layer of the skin, or the epidermis, is the keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. So it's filled with keratin. What is the function of stratified squamous epithelial tissue, or cells? Protection. And what are the characteristics or features of the cells of stratified squamous epithelium? We've already said that they're multiple layered, and the basal layer is composed of columnar or cuboidal that rests on the basement membrane. The middle is polyhedral, 3D, and the surface are, of course, flattened squamous cells, and they might be keratinized, such as in the epidermis. They can also ask you about the features of the basal cell layer of the stratified squamous epithelial tissue, and the answer is going to be the basal layer is composed of columnar or cuboidal cells that rest on the basement membrane. If they ask about the middle layer, they're polyhedral. And of course, if they ask about the surface, which is easy to remember because that's what we care about most of the time, of course it's going to be squamous bland, and they can be keratinized. Justify. The stratified squamous epithelial tissue is named as such, or like, why do we call it stratified squamous epithelial tissue? Of course, the name is based on the most superficial or surface layer or apical layer, which is composed of squamous cells. If the surface layer is keratinized, the tissue is referred to as keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. And the stratified indicates that the tissue is made up of more than one cell layer. Stratified cuboidal epithelial tissue. Now, the cells in the surface layer, of course, they're cuboidal, very predictable now. Like, we can predict what's in the superficial layer without prior reading. And the cells in the middle and the basal layers resemble those found in the stratified squamous epithelial tissue. So they resemble them. When I say resemble them, meaning they're going to be the same description. So for the basal layer, it's going to be columnar or cuboidal, and for the middle layer, they're going to be polyhedral. Okay, so that's an extra point here because that's pretty much easy. So we know that, okay, they're the same. The middle layer and the basal layer in both tissues are the same, so that's really easy to remember. And the tissue lines the inner surface of the sweat gland ducts and the seminiferous tubules. The seminiferous tubules are the tubules found in the testicle where sperm are produced and then try to transport it to the outside, well, through a lot of ducts. And then we're going to have the primary functions of the tissue are secretion and protection. What is the type of tissue in the inner lining of the sweat gland and the inner lining of seminiferous tubules? Of course, they are stratified cuboidal epithelial tissue. Function of the stratified cuboidal is going to be secretion and protection. And the characteristics or features of the cells of the stratified cuboidal epithelial tissue, as I said, there are going to be multiple layers. So when I say multiple layers, this is always applied to any stratified tissue. The base layer is going to be columnar or cuboidal, which resembles the cells found in the stratified squamous epithelial tissue. And the middle layers are polyhedral, again, resemble those found in stratified. And the cells on the surface are cuboidal. Also, they can ask you about the characteristics or features of the middle and the basal layers of the stratified cuboidal. And you're just going to say that they resemble the stratified squamous epithelial tissue and just describe them. So the middle layer are polyhedral and the basal layer are columnar and cuboidal. What are the features of the superficial layer? Of course, the cells are cuboidal. This is very easy. Justify. The stratified cuboidal epithelial tissue is named as such. Like, why do we call it stratified cuboidal? Well, the naming is based on the most superficial surface layer, which is composed of cuboidal. And the stratify indicates that the tissue is made up of more than one cell layer. Stratified columnar epithelial tissue. What are the characteristics or features? So we're going to have the surface cell of this tissue vertically oriented epithelial cells, while the basal and middle layers are or tend to be polyhedral and are usually smaller in size. So middle basal layers are polyhedral and smaller in size, and the surface or the apical layer, they're vertically oriented epithelial cells. The tissue is found lining the urethra. The urethra is just the structure that is connecting the bladder to the outside, basically. It's the structure that basically transports the urine during urination from the bladder. Now, the primary function of this tissue is protection. Question: what's the tissue type and lining of the urethra? The answer is going to be stratified columnar epithelial tissue. Question: function of the stratified columnar epithelial tissue or cells. Protection. Features or characteristic of the cell's stratified columnar epithelial tissue. Of course, multiple layer. Always mention this if it's stratified. Surface vertically oriented, basal and middle, they're polyhedral and smaller in size. Question: what is the difference in cell size between the superficial layer and the middle or basal layer of the stratified columnar epithelium? Of course, the basal and the middle layers are usually smaller in size. Here, they wanted the difference in the size, okay? So they're smaller in the basal and the middle layer. They can't ask stuff like that, okay? It's not unusual. And finally, we have the transitional epithelium, aka the urothelium, because it's mainly found in the urinary system, okay, like the bladder, ureters, the renal pelvis, or the kidney pelvis, which is a structure here. This tissue is a specialized type of stratified epithelium. Its surface cells are large, with a dome-shaped or umbrella-like apex, and typically contain 1 or 2 nuclei. The middle layer cells are polyhedral, while the basal layer cell appear cuboidal and rest on the basement membrane. The cells of the transitional epithelium have the ability to change their shape, making this tissue especially well suited to line the inner walls of organs that undergo stretching and contraction. Of course, this tissue is found lining the urinary bladder, ureters, and the kidney pelvis. The primary function of this tissue is protection, enables the organ it lines to expand and contract without damaging the epithelial cells. Question: function of the transitional epithelial cells. We said the primary function is protection, and it enables the organs it lines to expand and contract without damaging the epithelial cells. Give an example for each of the following. A specialized type of stratified epithelium. Now here, when we describe it, we said that it is a specialized type, so they can ask stuff like that. And the answer is just transitional epithelium or urothelium. Stratified epithelium with dome-shaped or umbrella-like surface cell. Of course, it's transitional epithelium. An epithelial cell with 1 or 2 nuclei. This is just from this description. They said that the apical cells contain 1 or 2 nuclei. So here, it's going to be the surface cell layer or the apical cell layer in the transitional epithelium contain 1 or 2 nuclei. Umbrella-shaped cell or dome-shaped cell. It's the surface cell layer in the transitional epithelium. An epithelial cell with the ability of changing their shape, of course, is the cells of the transitional epithelium. They can tell you to describe the nucleus or the characteristics or features of the nucleus of the cell layer in transitional epithelium, and the answer is just that these cells contain 1 or 2 nuclei. What are the characteristics or features of these cells? Well, already described everything. We said there are multiple layers. Okay, since we consider the transitional epithelium a stratified epithelium. So, of course, it's going to be multiple layered or multi-layered. Okay? Its surface cells are large, with a dome-shaped or umbrella-like apex and typically contain 1 or 2 nuclei. The middle layers are polyhedral, and the basal cell layers appear cuboidal and rest on the basement membrane. Do not forget this. Okay? They can give you a question telling you to describe the cells that rest on the basement membrane in the transitional epithelium. Meaning what? Meaning the basal layer, and they appear cuboidal. The cells of transitional epithelium have the ability to change their shape, making this tissue especially well suited to line the inner walls of the organs that undergo stretching and contraction. They can give you some justification questions here. For example, justify that the transitional epithelium tissue is well suited to line the inner walls of organs that undergo stretching and contraction because the cells have the ability to change their shape, making this tissue especially well suited to line the inner walls of organs that undergo stretching and contraction. It enables the organs it lines to expand and contract without damaging the epithelial cells. Justify the stratified epithelial tissue lining the urinary bladder is considered transitional. Same thing, so they have the ability to change their shape. It's well suited to the inner walls of the organs that undergo stretching and contraction. So you can get comparison questions that tell you to compare any two types of tissues. For example, the question compare stratified squamous epithelial tissue and transitional epithelial tissue was actually a question in one of the past papers. And to answer a question like this, just write down everything you know regarding the cell characteristics, location, function. So everything we've talked about, basically. It's really easy to answer these questions as long as you actually know what's up. And here we have the table comparing the stratified epithelial tissue in terms of location, function. We've discussed them already. There's nothing new here.